Hi, my name is John Brink. Thank you for watching A History of the BC Forest Industry. Thank you for watching our show today, and we're doing things a little bit different because we have adapted Zoom technology, and which is a little bit new to us, and this is our first show, and I'm delighted to have as our guest today Bill Phillips. Interesting person. Bill has been very involved in the news media in particular, and is the owner and editor of PG Daily News, a digital newspaper. And Bill, in particular, has been very, very involved in the interior, in the forest industry in particular. So I'm excited to have him as a guest. Thank you for being here, Bill.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
So, Bill, were you born in British Columbia, or how did you end up in northern British Columbia?
Yes, I was born in Fernie, down in the East Kootenay. I eventually ended up working for the paper in Fernie, and from there I moved to Kimberley as the editor at the Kimberley Daily Bulletin. Then from there to Williams Lake, where forestry really became a big issue, or was more of an issue. Down in the Kootenays, it was more mining towns. And then in 2006, I moved to Prince George and worked for the Prince George Free Press until its untimely demise in 2015.
Yeah, so but I always wonder is that how did you pursue a career in the news media? Because if I kind of look at myself, I've been my whole life in the forest industry, and my dad was involved in the forest industry, and so automatically I kind of went into that. Did something like that happen to you?
Yeah, my father was the editor of the paper in Fernie, and one day he came and suggested that I apply for a sports position. So there was no nepotism there, of course. So ended up getting the position, and worked in Fernie for almost 3 years, and then just sort of moved up the chain, as it were, and ended up here.
So you started out as were you right away an editor, or did you start on the lower steps?
No, I was started as the sports reporter, kind of a general reporter in Fernie, and then when I moved to Kimberley, I became the editor there, and then and actually I worked for a little bit in Invermere as well, a short stint there before moving to Williams Lake, where it was a much bigger paper, bigger town, bigger community, and I worked as a reporter there for a couple of years, then became the editor. I was the editor there for I think 11 years.
Oh yeah, in Williams Lake, so you gradually stepped on one step at this time, and then as other opportunities became available, you applied for it and you were hired. Now, the Williams Lake had, in those days, all these smaller communities had their own newspapers, right?
Yes, and often smaller communities often had two newspapers. When I was in Fernie, even, which was a town of 5,000 people. When I worked there, there was two newspapers there. Williams Lake, there was two newspapers there for a long, long time. And even when it came here at the Free Press, we were the little guys on the block, the weekly that went up against the daily. So there was always two newspapers.
Yeah, and then in Williams Lake, was it the Williams Lake Tribune that was the newspaper?
Yes.
Yeah, and you were the editor at
yes.
that particular paper. And then from there on, the reason that I talk about it so much about the newspaper and what happened to it is because we are in a changing world. Even as we speak, and this particular interview that we are doing is again a transition into a different form of media using the internet and Zoom, where we are not together sitting across the table, but we're doing it via the internet, and relatively new, right?
It's amazing to think we could do this. Like even a couple of years ago, I didn't even thought of doing something like this. So
in virtually seamless, right?
Yeah.
So then you were in Williams Lake, and I believe you went to Fernie or to Kimberley probably in 1987.
Yeah, 87. Was there from 1987 to about 91.
And then in 91, you came into Williams Lake, and all of a sudden, what changed for you is where when in Fernie, it was primarily mining, but then Williams Lake was totally right in the heart of the forest industry in the interior of the province. And you got right into that because you were the editor of the paper, and a lot of stories that you did were about the forest industry. You did a lot of investigative work. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, in the 90s, for those who remember that, there were some pretty raucous times in the forest industry. The Clayoquot Sound thing was going on at the time in the early 90s, which was the environment versus the forest industry debate. And more in the Caribou, there was the Commission on Resources and Environment, which was this whole huge process of trying to determine how we would, or where we would log in the forest, and how the resources in the community would be split up amongst all the stakeholders, so everyone had a say. It was a huge process, and we in the newspaper industry, we were right in the middle. Those meetings, the core meetings, were all public and quite often held in Williams Lake. So we as reporters, we sat in on those meetings, which were day-long meetings, virtually every time they had them, like it'd be 2 or 3 days at a time, and we sat in them from beginning to end. And there was huge discussions going on, and also
quite contentious at times, right?
Very contentious. It was Stephen Owen, who was the commissioner at the time. There was rallies going on. I remember one. There was a rally with, I think it was the bunch of the loggers. I think it was truck loggers outside the meetings, and Stephen Owen was there, and he addressed them. And we got an award-winning photo because in the middle of the thing, there was a bunch of very angry truck loggers, and they all looked angry. And Stephen Owen was standing there like this with his head in his hand. And we got that picture. Wendy McPhee actually took that picture, and it was an award-winning photo because it just encapsulated what's going on. All these loggers, they're there, and they're all the big burly logger guys. And Stephen, if you know him, he's a pretty slight guy, and he had the hand in his face. It was classic,
Yeah. And that was the time that, was contentious in terms of First Nations getting their access to fiber and to timber, and then the annual allowable cut. There was a tug of war as to who should get what. And at the same time, the industry even then was in transition, but it still was a period where you had these characters in the industry like Jay Kerr, the West Fraser, and those companies, and a number of other companies, Wellwood and Quanell, Dunkley, and so on, right?
Yeah, all these, during that time, there was the consolidation in the forest industry was going on, but it wasn't quite what it was today. Lignum in Williams Lake at that time was a big. They were a small company, but they were a big player. They had a lot of, they carried a lot of weight. Jake Kerr was involved in everything. There were. I'm trying to remember at the time, there was probably 5, maybe 6 major sort of companies at the time, where now you go to Williams Lake, there's probably 2, right? I think there's Tolko and West Fraser still have some.
And even those are struggling for fiber, right?
Yeah, everybody is. And at that time in the 90s, it was all about the allowable annual cut. And, there used to be a 2.5 committee in Williams Lake, which is they wanted the cut remain at 2.5 million cubic meters for the Williams Lake forest industry, and then on top of that there was something called the pulpwood agreement, which kind of built the cut up as well. And there was also an area called the Brittany Triangle, which is out in the Chilcotin, which was very contentious with the Silcotin. There was things like logging trucks would go in and they would get blockaded, and because the First Nations in the area, they felt they were getting shut out. of all the resource dollars, and just the age-old argument of not having a say of what is going on in their territory. So those
Exactly.
were huge issues that went on at the time.
Yeah. Now the other part that was also much part of it is it was the emerging of the secondary manufacturing industry, right? That had no tenure, but were trying to. There was a stimulus by the government of the day, to try to add more social and economic value to the resource and trying to stimulate secondary manufacturing.
Yeah, absolutely. Jack Pine Forest Products was a big operator down there, or for a secondary manufacturer. It wasn't big compared to West Fraser or Lignum or something like that, but he or they struggled for a long time. I think he went bankrupt a couple of times, and then managed to resurface and pushed on. Parallel Wood Products, I think they're operating up here a little bit. They were down there at a time trying to get into doing secondary manufacturing as well. But it's always been a struggle for secondary manufacturing, and it's always, fiber is key. It's getting a lot of these operations, as long as they can get fiber, they can be viable.
The key is always access to fiber, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the other challenges that the industry had since the 80s, I think in 1980 was lumber 1, lumber 2, lumber 3, right up to lumber 5 was the softwood lumber battles with the United States for access to the U.S. market, and all of that really started a long time ago. But at lumber 1 started really in 1980. It was either paying a duty or having quota restricted by the amount of volume you could export into the U.S. market.
Yeah, absolutely, and those were always huge issues as well. Obviously, in the interior, because of that, and at the time when the softwood lumber came up, it was, for a lot of those, it was very much for communities like Williams Lake, and certainly up here in Prince George. The softwood lumber debates was always about how well the forestry industry was going to be carrying forward, because some of these tariffs and stuff they put on were hugely restrictive and hugely damaging. So it'd be kind of like, if there's going to be a 30% tariff on wood going into the States, well, that might mean production drops 5%, 10%, whatever it is, right? And that means jobs. That means, and it rippled all the way down. It's always been a huge issue for the industry.
So right now, for instance, is a 21% duty for the last number of years, but then add to all of that, we had the pine beetle pandemic, which really started in the late 90s, and then really took a hold in 2000 and continued to about 2015, where a lot of the pine beetle, or the pine in the interior of the province, from one end to the other, about 75% of it was affected by the pine pandemic, and resulted in a lot of mills initially having a lot of extra volume, but then from there on in, we now are looking at that we have too much capacity and not enough timber.
Yeah, because one of the other things that, during that time in the 90s and into the 2000s, technical upgrades, that was always one of the key things especially for mills in the interiors, become much more efficient. And actually, as everyone knows, the mills in the interior, led the coast. We're way ahead of the coast, and certainly way ahead of down the States, right. Where mills weren't efficient at all. And so the interior led that efficiency. Now we have these hugely efficient mills that can process a lot of timber in a short period of time, but they don't have the fiber. It's just not there anymore.
Yeah, too much capacity, and because of pine beetle, but also because of spruce beetle, not enough fiber. And it's likely is connected to global warming. Little did we know, 6 months ago, when we looked at this as a perfect storm, we didn't add into that COVID-19, which turned it to a whole new dimension. to where we are today. So we have the challenges of an industry that is restructuring and resizing to a much smaller industry. Then we're still struggling with markets and you know, temporary shutdowns in sawmills, the ones that are left because of market value. Adding to that the COVID-19, is a whole different world out there.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I guess one of the technological advances where there's less people in the mill now kind of work in mill's favor, because there's not as many people working in close proximity of each other, but it's still happened. It's hard to work in an industry like that and keep social distancing. There's a lot of, if you're working on a piece of machinery and you're a mechanic, well, you might need more than 2 sets of hands working on something. So how do you keep that 6 foot distance? It must be tremendously challenging for the industry to keep operating in these kinds of, in this environment where they have to keep that physical distancing thing.
Well, it has changed the industry, in terms of the forest industry, we have to practice the distance proximity jobs and making sure that it is a new industry, wearing gloves, wearing masks where appropriate, and creating a clean environment. Sometimes I go into these mills and I can smell the bleach, of trying to keep things clean. But the COVID-19 may be with us for a while until they find a vaccine, or it is still very, very much part of our daily lives right now.
Yeah, and it's hit even in the tree planting industry. They were just announced a couple of days ago where there is going to be tree planting. The silviculture work is going to continue, but all the planters that arrive to go to work, before they can work, they have to quarantine themselves, or self-isolate, I guess is the proper term, for 14 days before they can go and actually work. So the season is going to be delayed. I'm not sure whether, I would imagine that if they go to work and then they're going to be quarantined for 14 days, that they're being paid. Here it is. It's a whole bunch of hurry up and wait kind of thing. They're going to go to work, but you just sit there and wait for your quarantine. Then you actually start tree planting. So things are going to be delayed. It really has an impact in so many different ways.
Now, as somebody that has worked in the news media for, pretty much the last 40 years, especially as it relates to the forest industry, to have access to information which is critical to you when you first started, in particular during your time that you were in Williams Lake in the 90s. You would be able to pick up the phone and then have reasonable expectations if you call the mill to be able to talk to the mill manager and get some, or the one of the board of directors, and get answers to some of the questions that you may have. What has happened since, obviously the structures of these organizations is much different, where you have communication directors that all the information flows through them. How has that affected you from a perspective of, especially during critical times when you need information to bring to your readers? How difficult, or how has it changed for you to have access to information?
It's changed completely. During those times, we would call the district forest manager for a story, for comments on a story, probably every couple of weeks, it seemed like. And we would get through. We would have the phone number for his office, and we'd call him. And the district forest manager, when all these things were going on about cuts and all that, and tremendous amount of power in the community or in the area that he manages about as to who gets to work where and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very important position, and so we had access to him. Now you could probably scan all the papers in the province and find a quote from a district forest manager. Now it just doesn't happen. Same as companies, like I said, in Williams Lake, we had the Kerrs. I could get Jake Kerr on the line probably within half an hour to comment on a story, or he's always made himself available. Same as other managers. So now that doesn't happen anymore. Journalists are now having to deal with communications people. There's nothing wrong with communications people, but a lot of the stories now, when you're talking about forestry issues, and a lot of them are very technical. So as a journalist, you want to talk to the expert. So those experts, they're harder to get hold of. It's not impossible, but most of the times, everything is vetted through a communications person. Interviews quite often aren't done in person anymore. They're done, you contact them and they say, well, email us some questions. We'll email you some responses. Which gives you some information, but a face-to-face interview or even a phone interview is much better. And those aren't happening now, not only in the forest industry, but all over.
Now, the other thing that has happened, Bill, since when you were in Verney and then in Kimberley and then in Williams Lake and then in Prince George, most of those communities had as many as 2 newspapers. And when you were in Prince George, and even in Williams Lake, it started changing because of the internet, social media, and the print media started to change. And like in Prince George, the Free Press, and you worked for them, I think, for 9 years as the editor. It was sold at one point. It was Black that owned it at one point, and I believe a fellow by Bob Duval bought it and then phased it out in 2015. And pretty much the other papers that you left behind in Williams Lake, Kimberley, and Verney likely do not exist anymore either. And then you had to kind of reinvent you as a deliverer of information to a whole different media, and you started Prince George Daily News. How did that go?
Well, it's keep me busy and out of trouble, I guess. So I'm still working at it. So it's a different world. Back in the 80s, the joke about newspapers or community newspapers was that you needed a grocery store and a car dealership in town, and if you had that, you could run a newspaper because they would advertise enough. Everything else was gravy. It was in probably the late 80s, early 90s that grocery stores learned that they could do their own flyers, so that left. And then in the recession of 2008 or so, car dealers realized that they could go on the internet and sell, so that advertising left. So 2 of the big major advertisers over the last 20 or 30 years in newspapers have kind of disappeared. And then newspapers did it to themselves, where they used to sell prescription or subscriptions all the time. Right. And now they've moved to a free model in a lot of them. Free press was one. And so they gave up that model of that revenue stream as well. So it's, for newspapers, it's been kind of a perfect storm over the last few years, where there used to be a license to print money, and now all the revenue streams are drying up. And COVID-19 is really hurting newspapers.
Yeah. So the way I see it, is that every day I read the Prince George Daily News, and I like it. Obviously I'm familiar with the editor being you. So you have, as an individual, you have the credibility of the history, which makes you attractive to readers. You are being very effective in delivering the news on a daily, instant basis, which is very interesting. And then the other part, correct me if I'm wrong, you have developed quite a readership of well into the 30,000 or 35,000. How many readers do you have?
It's about 35,000 a month.
Yeah, that's a lot.
That's a lot. Well, some of those are return readers, obviously. So
Right.
But yeah, it builds up. It takes time. It's interesting because newspapers were all about delivery, which is when you got your newspaper, how do you deliver it, how do you get it out to people, and digital news is the same way. It's all about delivering the news, which nowadays is done through Facebook and through Twitter and through Instagram. That's your delivery mechanism, because you post your stories on there, you get followers on your Facebook page, and hopefully they'll see it and then click onto it. So it's in some ways it's very similar. It's about getting readers, and it's about distributing your product effectively, and
But
it's
you
just doing it
are
in a
there
different way.
too. You
Pardon
are
me?
there as an individual when things are happening in town. I always see you there with your microphone and your camera, and
Oh yeah.
you're very, very active, and certainly recommend to our listeners, to check into Prince George Daily News from far and wide. If you want to have the news about Prince George, Bill Phillips is the guy that delivers it. I'm delighted to have you had as my guest, Bill. This is our first Zoom. I hope it goes well, and I thank you very much for being my guest.
Well, thanks for the invite. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for watching A History of the BC Forest Industry, and we hope to see you the next time.